And what you'll hear from today from our panel is that you'll see that we're not too far removed from the injury. We're living the injury right here, right now. And you're going to hear about that with the panel that we brought together in the area of the general health of our community, housing, and trauma. And with our first presenter, we're going to bring forward Sister Cecile Johnson. Sister Cecile Johnson has a master's degree from the Center of Inner City Studies right in Chicago. She's no longer living with us, but we're glad to have her back. We benefited greatly from her research while she was here, and it was only fitting that we bring her back. Cecile Johnson is a human rights defender. She's a co-facilitator of the African Descended Nation and African Descended Nations Confederated USA. She has co-authored the book, The Process, Civil Rights and Human Rights. She is also the CEO and founder of the African Development Plan and Secretary of the Board of the National Black Agenda Consortium, Chicago, which put together a National Black Agenda here in the city of Chicago. It's a fabulous document that has been presented several years to the elected officials here in the city of Chicago. And she's co-authored the 2017 National Black Agenda. So with that, I'm going to bring forth Sister Cecile Johnson.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
He's only giving me 20 minutes, and we have a lot of things happening to us, so I'm going to try to run quickly because we were supposed to show a PowerPoint, but we don't have access, okay? So what we'll do is we'll just talk about it. So first, let me frame this. Afro-descendants are indigenous to the Americas, and we're here before 1619. So I'm not on a 400-year journey. We've been here since long before that. Our Ma'afa, which is our great suffering, happened long before that, when the Spanish and the French came in the 1500s. Our ancestors were already here. Only 388,000 Africans came through the last dispensation of the slave trade. So when people ask you something, there was no transatlantic slave trade. We say it's a transatlantic war against African descendants, and it never ended. So we are prisoners of war. As prisoners of war, we fall under the Geneva Convention, the Fourth Geneva Convention, and my role is a human rights defender. So when we frame this, how are we doing? We look at the right to development, and the right to development is a declaration, and it looks at your social, economic, cultural, political process, and we cover what they call three things: a long and healthy life, access to knowledge, that's your education, and a decent standard of living, and we look at that through the geography, where you're located. As you know, our zip code does matter in the United States, your gender, and your race and ethnicity. So how are the people doing? By the Human Development Index 2016, not very well. On the scale of 10, black people are 4.02, Latinos 4.59, whites at 5.63, and Asians at 7.69. So we are not doing well. And black men are at 3.57, okay? Other than Native American men, who are 3.29, not doing well. When you look at major cities across the country, black and Latinos are always on the bottom, and as it comes to Chicago, we, the African Americans, are at the bottom. There are now about 800,000 people in Chicago. We used to be, in 2000, we were 40% of the population. We are now 29.3% of the population, and we lost 250,000 people, right? So Chicago is really a tale of two cities, and the impact of the black flight from Chicago is that larger families with children, almost entirely confined to two age ranges, 35 to 54 and under, and 19 and under. That's why you see the closings of the schools, so we lost about 80,000 children. In 2010, the middle income majority black neighborhoods in Cook County, there were 47 of them, and half of them were in Chicago, about 23. In 2017, 7 years later, 27 majority black neighborhoods, middle and 17 in Chicago. So you see we've lost that. So there was a racial divide that came out in 2017, and it says the story of Chicago is one of access. Chicago is a product of decades of policies that have isolated people of color, right? And so we know about the exclusionary zoning laws, the racially restrictive covenants, the racial steering, and these boundaries went beyond real estate. They have far-reaching implications on whole communities, your access to health care, financial services, and especially education. And as the gentleman who spoke said, that makes a big difference. So in Chicago, these nations and these boundaries are far worse than that's in the nation, because Chicago is very rigid with its racial boundaries. So decades of these policies give the following outcomes. When you look at our median household income, it's $30,303. We have a 67% poverty rate. 33% of our household have zero net worth. Home ownership is down 35%, it's at 35%. Whites is 54%. Our 8th grade reading level is only like 11%, right? I'm gonna go into this slowly after. High school graduation allegedly is 81.9%, but we know a lot of those children leaving school and can't read. Bachelor's degree is only 11.3%, and professional degree 7%, and our unemployment rate is about 21%. So it's not that fictitious number that they like to throw out. So when you look at what's going on with us, where you live does impact how you live, and because of the city segregation, that has had a proxy for shorter life expectancies and poor health. And so in Chicago in 2012, something interesting was happening. Chicago at that time showed a 14-year difference in life expectancy between black and white life, right? And then mysteriously in 2019, when I looked at the data again, we had jumped from a 14-year gap to a 30-year gap, okay? So something is happening to us. When you look at the leading cause of death, we are the only group as a race that has homicide, HIV, and septicemia, right? Septicemia is a blood poisoning. Black mothers keep dying, and all across the country, New York Times, NPR, everybody's running stories, right? Black women are 3 times more likely to die giving birth in the city of Chicago, and black babies are twice as likely to die before their first birthday. So some of this has a lot to do with that black communities have easier access to fast food than to fresh food, right? So the food desert is real. And so the food desert means you have access to all these other things. The distance from your grocery store does have a option. We're the only country where you look, you see, I shouldn't say the only country. When you think of poor people, you think of skinny people. But in America, when you're poor, you kind of tend to be a bit obese, right? And that is also impacting the mothers and their maternity and their maternal-maternity numbers. So obesity, we have about 48.4% of our black adults are obese, and about 19.5% of our black children are obese. And when you look at diabetes, we are the 14.7% of our population in Chicago. Diabetes has been on the rise, but it's hit us very bad. So you'll have more diabetic, you see it in our community, you can't find any jobs, but you see diabetes centers, right? When it comes to HIV/AIDS, Afro-descendants are the majority of the new HIV diagnosis and the most affected. We're 45% of the total, 62% of the women, 64% of infected. Infections are attributed to heterosexual contact, right? So there's a myth about all of this. And 64% of the children under age 13. So when you look at us, we're not doing too well there either. Now let's talk about this craziness. As I was coming, I saw a body lying in the street and the police were all around it, right? So every 3 hours, somebody gets shot in Chicago, and every 16.56 hours, somebody is dead. And 80.7% of those people who are shot are the ones who are dead. And 81% of the people who are shot are males. So we're losing a lot of black men through this violence. The bodies are piling up, and when you look at the data, Hey Jackass is a good website, right? Majority of the assailants are unknown. So some of this is us, some of it is not. When you look at Austin, Inglewood, Garfield Park, North Lawndale, Humboldt Park, Roseland, Grand Crossing, Auburn Gresham, South Shore, Chicago Lawn, Little Village, near West Side, Chatham, South Chicago, New City. That's where a lot of this violence is happening. We're talking about hundreds of people shot, and in the 10s, 20s, 53, 40, different numbers dying. So this is really serious, right? We can't have a weekend we don't have this crime and violence. And those killings cost us about $2.5 billion. Why? Because when you get shot, if you live, we have to send you to the emergency room. When you go to the emergency room, we got surgery and all these other things, right? So when you don't put your money up front and invest in the community, you will spend your money behind cleaning up the mess, okay? So that's what's going on with us. When it comes to suicide recently, self-reported suicide attempts of black adolescents rose by 73% between 1991 and 2017. And you can understand that is children below the age of 10 and children above the age of 10. When a child below 10 is trying to kill himself, things are rough, okay? That's the data for us, up 73%. So when you look at racial disparities in healthcare, you'll see that we go to the doctor, sometimes you can't even get an appointment, and if you do, they keep you waiting a long time. And then there's the stereotypes about when we go and our propensity towards pain. So we get it coming and we get it going, right? Now, only 5% of the doctors are black, so we have a shortage in our community, and many times we have people who are very insensitive through racism and lack of cultural bias towards us, so therefore we don't get the care we need. So even when you are suffering, you're still suffering because you can't communicate with people who are supposed to be dealing with you. When it comes to human trafficking, 62% of the human trafficking suspects are African American. 52% of all juvenile prostitution arrests are African American. Now just remember this, these are juveniles. Somebody put them out there in the street, right? They're really being trafficked. And 40% of the victims are human trafficking are African Americans. But because the law is so lax when it comes to anything that you do to black people, these statistics continue to grow. Wow. Chicago is the top 5 city in the nation for sex trafficking. When it comes to education, the seeds of success start young. And when you look at us, when you look at the children, 33% of Illinois 8th graders are proficient in math, but only about 10% of those are black. The CPS likes to put out this data and talk about how things are doing well, and the next day they put out the data and say, but not for black children. And so if you had seen my presentation, you would see where everyone, Latino and black and white, have been doing well, but the black educational achievement level has not really gone up. So 11% of 8th graders are reading on level, and 10% of 8th graders are proficient in math. This means that when they get to high school, folks, they can't do what they need to do. Hence, you see the people dropping out. Because when you get to high school, the high school teachers will teach you at the high school level, right? So when those children leave 12th grade, 16% of them are reading on level, 14% nationwide are on level in math, and 10% in science. So what you're looking at is how the uneducated becomes unemployed, because that's where they are. In a society where we close on all those factories, and then the jobs are more technology-based, you don't have an education, you cannot cross that digital divide. So why is the right to education fundamental? Because it's an individual and society benefit from your right to education. The gentleman spoke and said what that means. You're now able to get jobs, you're able to participate in democracy, you're able to run for office, you're able to do so many things. All right, so it's a fundamental human, social, and economic development and a key element to achieving lasting peace and sustainable development. It's an empowerment right, and it lifts marginalized groups out of poverty. Education used to do that. So we got to reframe how we think about violence. Violence is when you send a black child to school for 12 years and you get 6 years of education, right? That's violence. So in Chicago, you see, and in Illinois, that we have a wrong state of priorities. We have 69% of the youth that are incarcerated are black, right? 69% at a cost to the taxpayers of $94 million for 546 youth. Imagine if we spent that money in our community to do intervention work with them. And so Illinois spends $172,000 to incarcerate the youth versus $6,000 to redeploy that youth in the community-based alternatives. 172 versus 6. Which would you like to spend? We are 15% of the population, and we are 56% of the incarcerated. Illinois is so bad at incarceration that when they put the map up, they show that it is past most of the developed nations in the world, the wealthy democracies, when it comes to how many people we have incarcerated. And we know that incarceration, depending on the state that you live in, has a lot to do with whether you can vote or don't vote, right? And so that's really just a way to disenfranchise you. When you look at our legal system, less than 5% of our lawyers are black, which means that many of them can never become prosecutors, and your prosecutor or your solicitor is the power in your district. And so we'll never be that. 1 in 9 black children have an incarcerated father. More than 1 out of every 6 black men today have been, between the age of 25 and 54, have disappeared. How did they disappear? They were locked up in that mass incarceration, war on drugs, which is really a war in the black community, and they are also the high homicide rates, right? So what does that mean? It means that when it comes to marriage, black women, there is 15% more black women than there are men, because the men missing and or dead. And if they are alive, they can't get a good job. And if they're the last hired, they're the first fired. And so they're not a good match, right? So we have all of these struggles. Moynihan in 1965 saw a clear link between family structure and growing social problems such as poverty and crime among the black population. You don't need to look any further than your TV screen tonight when you go home, and you will see the outcomes of that. So though marriage has gone down across the nation, blacks are still one of the largest groups that are not married, and it's the men and the women. It's about 36%. So, we know why the incarceration skyrocketed because of Nixon and the war on drugs. Let's see. We also have the highest divorce rate. Black, Latinos and whites are 16.3 and 18.1. We are double that. We are 30.4 divorces. The structure of what's going on in our life. What does it mean to be poor? Black people have a 22% poverty rate. In Illinois, it's 26.2%. In the city of Chicago, we are about 1 in 3. Right? So though you'll see a big, you would have seen this thing, Chicago household income growth. Not for us. Every time they're talking about something, it's nothing about us. Okay? So, black unemployment has consistently been twice that of whites, and this is not yesterday, this is like 6 decades, it's always been. And when it comes to the youth, about age 20 to 24, about 40% of them are employed. So that's what you're seeing in the street, right? They might have entrepreneurial skills, but they selling the wrong thing because we have not created opportunities in the neighborhood for them. When you look at the racial wealth gap, in 2010, the average white household had 22 times the amount of income. So from $5,000 for us and $110,000 for them. It's actually gotten larger since. They said in 2016 that's going to take 228 years for us to build the wealth of a white family. And that's assuming that they don't do nothing else. And of course, they're not going to not do anything else, so we will never catch up, right? So by the year 2053, they say that the black community will have a zero net worth, okay? And then we had a big scandal. So the other day they had talk about the loss of Afro-descendant land has contributed to the zero net worth. We lost about 1 million acres. So on every front, we had a first black president, whoopie doing, nothing happened. The Kerner Commission reported racism 50 years later, that we had a little progress and then it stopped, and we were resegregating our cities and our schools and condemning millions of children to inferior education and taking away the real possibility of getting out of this. Housing in Chicago, housing ownership in 1968 was 40, and 50 years later it remains at 40, right? We thought before that it was just the racist landlords, etc., but it wasn't. It was de jure segregation, government-sponsored through policy that the government put into place. Right? You only gave me 20 minutes, so I'm going to run through that part. But the basic bottom line is you buy a house for $10,000 in the 1950s, and today you're selling it for $300,000 to $400,000. That's where that wealth came from, but we were not allowed to do that, so therefore we did not get to build that wealth. Okay? They only give us this land when they finish with it. We get it as a whatnot. So, when we do get a home, then we have what we encounter what they call the segregation tax. So even in our neighborhoods, you'll find that the houses are devalued, and in Chicago, it is 28% our houses in our neighborhood. Same house, same square foot, sometimes bigger. No. Then in 2008, we saw all this foreclosure. So what does that mean? In Illinois, a black person is 8 times more likely to experience homelessness than a white person. Right? Have I given you any good news here today? Right? How long does the money circulate in the black community? 6 hours. You don't even stay overnight, not even for lunch, right? So when you look in our communities, everybody's there but us. We need an investment in the black community. When we had TIF funds were spent on the loop near north side, near south side and the near west side, right? But the TIF, we spent $4 billion on Pullman, Riverdale, Roseland, West Pullman, and far south side. The TIF was supposed to cover this, but the TIF never did. And then whenever the city has spent on minority contracts, in 2016, 11% of the contract went to us. We were at that time 33% of the population, right? And then in 2017, that dropped to 7.8% of the contracts. So even when they're giving out stuff, we're not getting it. Why? Because if you look at our education levels and our ability to have capital to build a business, that's not happening. So guys, we need a help. Right? We don't need to get excited anymore about when they try to give us invest in the challenged neighborhoods and spend a little money, because in reality we're talking about billions of dollars. Chicago's budget is $11.5 billion. We are 29% of the population, 30% of the population. We should be getting $3.5 billion of that. So urban renewal is really black removal. And on the human rights, what we're talking about is gentrification, is forced displacement. In foster care, we're 15% of the population and 50% of the children in foster care. Ain't nobody trying to help our families so they can take care of their children. That is genocide. 5 elements of the crime of genocide: genocide by killing, genocide by causing serious bodily or mental harm, genocide by deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about physical destruction, genocide by imposing measures intended to prevent birth, and genocide by forcibly transferring children. What does that look like for us? Unarmed black people being killed by the police, disproportionate mass incarceration, colonizer police occupying our communities, all them blue lights everywhere, disproportionate exposed black communities to environmental toxins and emissions, lack of economic investment in our community, substandard access to food and health care leading to the worst health in the country, high infant mortality and maternal mortality, experimenting on and medicating our children. They've had places where they were using AIDS drugs on foster care children, racial disparity in healthcare and social conditions leading to high suicide attempts by black kids and high placement of our child in foster care. In order for us to be considered a crime of genocide, we only need one of those elements, and we meet all 5.
Wow.
So,
Reparations now.
Reparations now.
2016, the UN came. 2016, the UN came, and when they came, we were here at Chicago State, and we had a massive outpour. And the people gave testimony and testified, and the UN said that based on what they saw, there was a continuing link between present injustice and the dark chapter of American history. So when Mitch McConnell talked about, oh, it wasn't yesterday, listen, everything I just told you happening right now, today, okay? So I don't need to go back to then, because it's happening right now. And so what it said is that the U.S. owed its black population reparations, which is why we're here. Reparations is repair, right? And so what they found is that the U.S. has not, just like it signed ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, I can't mention. Article 1 says all people have a right to self-determination. When an international law is ratified by the United States, it's supposed to then be implemented. The U.S. has failed to implement many of the laws that they have signed and ratified, and even not ratified some of the ones that they pretend to the world that they're in agreement. The U.S. is the greatest violator of human rights based on its treatment of black people here in the United States. And how does this impact other people of color around the world? The way that they treat us is the same contemptuous way they treat others. So helping us really does help. And then you see elections and disenfranchisement, the gerrymandering, right? You should see some of our congressional districts. In my little PowerPoint you would have. So here's what we have. Colonization is what's happening to us. It's a process by which a central system of power dominates the surrounding land and its components. And anyone who walks through our community would agree that we are colonized people, right? And we're 13% of the population, and we have 3 senators. How is that? We should have 13 senators if we were always fair, right? And so in 152 years, we've had 10 African descendants served in the U.S. Senate. Again, allegedly in 1865, you were free. That's not true. You were not free. 3 things should have happened. You should have, 1, those who were recently here from Africa could have been sent back, right? 2, we were a sovereign people before you got here, so therefore we should have set up sovereign status. Or 3, you could have been forcefully integrated. And we have been forcefully integrated till now. Yeah?
We had to bring her all the way down to South Carolina. Cecile gave a general picture of the ill health of the black community here in Chicago, but it's representative of black people around this country. And if it's happening in the same place in urban area after urban area, it can't be something that's germane to Chicago, why our communities look this way. It has to be a result of long-term policy and actions nationwide. And again, you will see this same state of ill health across the country.